It's a bit daunting to be invited to speak on the very important and central topic of reciprocity, which is how I interpret the whole subject matter of partnership societies. By partnership society, this is not a word. I'm an ecologist, okay, so I'm a scientist. And partnership society is not a term that I was actually familiar with in quite that way, but I understand this to mean talking about reciprocity. So I guess the first thing I want to say is that already we are in reciprocity, because it's very odd that I, who am descended from Dutch and English people, should be standing here talking about reciprocity. So already we're doing what we're talking about. And let me tell you, it's intimidating. So I'm going to start off by doing something odd, which is to point out that the term partnership societies is currently in the popular consciousness, not thanks to the old and respected traditions that we might think. It's in the popular consciousness, as are many things, and we could perhaps talk about how that happens and why that happens and whether or not this is a good thing in some other context. But in any case, it is in the popular context, thanks in part to David Korten, who's worked on something called The Great Turning. And Korten acknowledges the work of Riane Eisler, another non-native person, in making the distinction between dominator and partnership societies. So this is useful, and I want to bring it to your mind. And because it was simple and because it was easy, I just took it off the web. Like I say, I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not going to pretend that I am and go into great detail about how this has a very long millennial, tens of millennial heritage. Instead, I'm just going to use David Korten's expression. This is from his 2002 keynote address to the Revitalizing Democracy Conference. So it's a bit of shorthand, okay? And what he says is that the partnership model is built on a sense of community that supports relationships based on mutual respect, caring, and responsibility to and for the whole. It is based on a belief in democracy and the human capacity for compassion and cooperation. And so I think that these are very good words: relationships, community, support, mutual respect, caring, responsibility, the whole, democracy, capacity, compassion, cooperation. These are not new words. These are very old and ancient words. I think I'm going to skip the next few slides, which talk about the flip side of that, because I don't think we need to talk about the flip side of that today. What does this, as a scientist, I want to then talk a little bit about what does all this have to do with ecosystem science and natural resources. So let's think about how we conceptualize our relationship as a species with other species, as well as with wind and water and soil and rocks. Scientists and land managers talk about natural resources. Partnership societies think instead about family members who actually have their own cultures and their own responsibilities in this world. Resources are, well, things to be used in various ways, as tools, as medicines, as food, as sources of energy. But think, today, even most people have become resources. Think of all the institutions that we work in that have human resource departments, okay? So what if instead these co-inhabitants of the planet were conceived of as equal partners in an integrated and complex story of existence? Perhaps by careful observation and listening, we humans could learn from these, our partners in existence. This is one aspect of partnership societies. Note that I say learn from, not learn about. Learning about one's friends and relations is important, of course, but it's only the beginning of the conversation, isn't it? Equal partners learn from one another. This is one aspect of reciprocity. And then there's the matter of responsibilities. In a relationship, everyone has responsibilities. What are our responsibilities towards those we consider resources? Does this change if they become not resources, but independent beings with their own cultures and their own responsibilities in this world? So Chief Irving Paulus Jr., who's an Onondaga elder, he believes that this business of responsibilities, he, among many other people, believe that this business of responsibilities is the key to balanced relationships. And the way, one of the things he has said that has been written down is that the U.S. colonists took only the parts of the Haudenosaunee ideas of government that they liked. If it were up to us, he says, we wouldn't have written a Bill of Rights without a Bill of Responsibilities. So this business of learning from versus learning about is in a way wonderfully exemplified by the discipline of anthropology. Now, as a non-native person, I've always been a bit wary of learning about culture via anthropology because, as has been discussed before today, it's essentially an outsider's perspective on culture, and I'm not particularly interested in outsiders' perspectives on things that I'm interested in because, as has been said, they can't help but reflect the values, constraints, and worldviews of the observer. How you disentangle the original from the secondary is really problematic. So it's always seemed to me that if one wants to know something about a culture, then one needs to listen to those who are of that culture. This is learning from rather than learning about. But it seems to me that the same can be said, for example, about ecosystem science. The way we go about scientific investigation in the Western science tradition can essentially be conceived of as an anthropology of the living world. Ecosystems are objects of study. We learn about them. But we place no emphasis at all on learning from them. In contrast, indigenous cultures worldwide have spent millennia learning both from and about the inhabitants of their traditional homelands. Well, I've had the opportunity and challenge and privilege of learning from many people, sometimes from books and sometimes in person. And I'm going to start here with one of those people. I've never actually met, well, that's not true, actually. I have met Gregory Kahete. But in the introduction the foreword to this book, Native Science, which came out in 2000, Leroy Littlebear, who wrote the foreword, wrote, "The Native American paradigm is comprised of and includes ideas of constant motion and flux. Constant motion and flux. Existence consisting of energy waves, interrelationships, all things being animate, space, place, renewal, and all things being imbued with spirit." In this view, everything is in flux at all times, is in transformational process at all times, and notions of control become absurd because things are not and never will be static. In fact, the very concept of things becomes problematic. All is relationship, is perhaps dance. My Inupiat colleagues point out that what gives them trouble in translations is the nouns. Verbs are easy, but nouns, well, you see, the names of things change depending on their relationship with each other. So Kahete points out that in this kind of worldview, engagement with the world becomes of necessity participatory. You can't stand just outside and study it. It's participatory. It's a partnership. One might imagine an aikido of engagement. Well, in my view, as a scientist, it only makes sense for different ways of knowing and understanding the world, for people who are bearers of different ways and knowing about the world, to work together. There are things that Western science does very, very well. There are other things that native science does very, very well. In these times of unprecedented ecological change, none of us can afford any longer the questionable luxury of working solely within our own traditions if we are to learn how to live sustainably. Conserving our options means, in part, conserving the diversity of ways of thinking about the world. So, I imagine that many of the people who are listening to this who have not been raised traditionally, maybe non-native, people might be wondering about this bit about learning from the world. What does that mean exactly? And to help unpack this a little, I'd like to conclude by reading some sections from an as-yet unpublished essay by my friend and colleague, Dr. Robin Wall-Kimmerer, who is an enrolled member of the citizen band Potawatomi. And this is an essay, these are parts of an essay called The Three Sisters. Robin teaches and works in the Northeast and has been working with Haudenosaunee people for decades. So this is The Three Sisters. It should be them who tell this story, but they are quiet beings whose voices are hard to hear, especially in the wind. I've stood among them and listened. The loudest thing is my own heartbeat. But then, as you settle into the quiet, there's more. Corn leaves rustle with a signature sound, a papery conversation with each other in the breeze. And on a hot day in July, when the corn can grow 6 inches in a day, there is a squeak of internodes expanding, stretching the stem toward the light. The beans must make a caressing sound, a tiny hiss as soft-haired leader twines around the scabrous stem of corn. Surfaces vibrate delicately against each other. Tendrils pulse as they cinch around the stem, but only a flea beetle standing nearby could hear. But just as the sounds of the corn are the sounds of being and not the voice. This is not the song of the beans. I've lain among ripening pumpkins, and this is what I hear, a creaking as the parasol leaves rock back and forth, tethered by their tendrils. Wind lifts the edges of leaves and eases them down again. A microphone in the hollow of a swelling pumpkin would reveal the pop of seeds filling and the rush of water filling succulent orange flesh. These are sounds, but not the story. Plants tell their stories not by what they say, but what they do. What if you were a teacher, a keeper of great knowledge, but had no voice to speak it, and had no pen to write it? What if you had no language at all, and yet there was something you needed to say? Wouldn't you dance it? Wouldn't you act it out? Wouldn't your every movement tell the story? In time, you would become so eloquent that just to gaze upon you would reveal it all. And so it is with these silent green leaves. You know, there's so much I want to share from this essay, and Robin has given me permission to share this even though it's unpublished. But there isn't time. And so I'm just going to pick a few pieces, even from the very brief pieces that I had outlined for this, and read you these small paragraphs. Together, she's speaking of the corn and the beans and the pumpkins and the squash. Together they are artwork. She's speaking about the form, tall, curling, spreading. They are artwork that has created itself from the laws of complementarity. The organic symmetry of forms belongs together. The placement of each leaf, the harmony of shapes, speaks their message. Respect one another, support one another, bring your gift to the world, and receive the gifts of others, and there will be enough for all. The way of the three sisters reminds me of one of the basic teachings of our people, Robin writes. The most important thing a person can know is their unique gift and how to use it in the world. Individuality is cherished and nurtured, for to be in community, you don't surrender your individuality. In order for the whole to flourish, each person has to be strong in who they are, to carry their gift with conviction so it can be shared with others. Being among the three sisters reminds us that in reciprocity we fill our spirits as well as our bellies. So, upon feasting, she writes, the three sisters, they've each brought their gifts to this table, but they've not done it alone. They remind us also that there is another partner in the symbiosis. She is sitting right here at the table and across the valley in the farmhouse too. She's the one who noticed the ways of each species and imagined how they might live together. Perhaps we should consider this a four sisters garden, for the planter is also an essential partner. It is she who turns up the soil, it is she who scares away the crows, and she who pushed those three seeds into the soil. We are the planters, the ones who clear the land, pull the weeds and pick the bugs. We save the seeds over the winter and plant them again next spring. We are the midwives of their gifts. We cannot live without them. But it's also true that they cannot live without us. Corn, beans, and squash are fully domesticated. They rely on us to create the special conditions under which they can grow. We too are part of the reciprocity. They can't meet their responsibilities unless we meet ours. This is how the world keeps going. So we have a few minutes for questions. And what I'd like to do is, while you're thinking about that, is to put together a little sort of rotating slideshow here, and it's timed. Hopefully it'll keep going, but I'll click it if it doesn't. These are just some books, some people who have been important to me and to my understanding of these matters, these particular matters. So this will just continue to rotate, and you can take notes. I've also made a reading list, so which I understand will be posted to the web. So while we're enjoying that, any questions or comments, and not just for me, but for anybody who's spoken?
I have a question. Often we don't learn how to really think integratively or really see these connections until we get into our upper division courses in college. We're kind of force-fed and maybe on a linear track through all our primary education. Are there opportunities for starting to think differently when we're younger to really start to foster this kind of thought?
What a beautiful question.
And maybe Esther has some comments too on that.
Yeah, I would like it if other people would speak to that question. I think it's a great question, and it's also a very difficult question.
Sure.
So I would invite
Richie or Esther.
Delphine and Kurt and Esther as you're moved. I mean, I think to some extent what we're talking about is education that begins before school, right?
Sure.
So, I mean, I think what we're talking about really is how we behave as parents. And so perhaps these are things, it's been 500 years since immigrants have more or less overrun the Americas. It's going to take a few generations now that we're finally learning how to talk with each other. We're finally starting to learn that. In my lifetime, this dialogue, I think, it's always been there. But now, I mean, look, we're streaming on the web. This conversation is like, who knows who's listening to it. So this is, I think, really about parents and parenting. Rich, yeah.
According to the California state standards, when you mention linear learning versus, I guess, let's say a native perspective of learning, you go to the first grade, the second grade, and so on and so forth, eventually making it to grad and post-grad and so on and so forth. But for the most part, when I'm talking to students and I'm presenting the California state standards of teaching in classes, in the first grade they're learning about themselves. They're learning about their hands, where they live, their immediate family. They're learning shapes. They're learning all these things that affect their little selves and their little world. On into the second grade, they're breaking out into their family a little bit more, and eventually into the third grade, they're learning about their city. In the fourth grade, they're learning about their state. In the fifth grade, they're learning about their nation, the country itself. And then on into the sixth grade, they're getting into world history and outside of their own country, which is a very linear, very lined, very processed way of learning. But in our societies, in many of our societies, I should say, it's the opposite of that, and we learn that we're a part of a world first, and that there's things happening outside of what we got going on, and eventually care and learn about ourselves at a later time, and want to learn about ourselves at a later time. But it's really that connection of and being a part of that circular system. And oftentimes our families are not necessarily your traditional families. We're not necessarily just mother and father with 2.1 kids, but rather we have a grandparent that's usually within our circle, our immediate family. We have an aunt or a crazy uncle staying with us at some point. And I mean that in a good way. I mean, I love you, Uncle, but I mean that in the best way possible. But it is part of that circular system. It is part of being in a larger system, other than just what. And I hope it sort of addresses your question, but I just wanted to kind of make that point: linear versus circular learning. So, cool. Thank you.
And I wanted to add also that part of our family, we have the Tree Clan, who are our original teachers, and we have Grandmother Spider and the Uncle Wolf and the soil who we all come from. And so that's all part of our reciprocity circle too. And everyone has an oral history. They share that with our babies when we're nursing them and singing to them. Our oral histories are just a little different between us, but we're all family.
Thank you very much. I should just say that it's an extreme honor to be here in this way.